Our final speaker today is Dr. Drew Helmer. Dr. Helmer is an expert in military exposures and deployment-related health concerns and the impact of combat deployment on the health and well-being of former military service members. He is Deputy Director of the Center for Innovations in Quality, Effectiveness, and Safety, IQuESt, at the Michael E. DeBakey VA Medical Center and Professor of Medicine in the section of Health Services Research at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, Texas. He is former director of the War-Related Illness and Injury Center, RISC, at the VA New Jersey Healthcare System. Dr. Helmer is a member of the Research Advisory Committee on Gulf War Veterans Illnesses, which advises the Secretary of VA on research strategy, and a VA champion for the VA DoD evidence-based clinical practice guideline for the management of chronic multi-symptom illness. In addition to caring for veterans and educating providers about post-deployment health, Dr. Helmer studies healthcare utilization and outcomes important to deployed veterans, including chronic pain, military exposure concerns, depression, suicidal ideation, mild traumatic brain injury, and sexual health concerns. He has published more than 100 peer-reviewed articles and a book for the general population on these topics. I will now hand it over to you, Dr. Helmer.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm going to need to do a quick tech check. Are my slides appearing now?
Yes, they are.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And today I'm going to be talking about the genomics of Gulf War illness. This is a million veteran program project that we call CSP 2006. And I'm co-chair, and I'll talk at the end about all of the cast of thousands that work on this project with me. Sorry, let's make sure we go. Okay, so what are we trying to do with this project? So the Million Veteran Program, as you might be aware, is a major initiative by the VA to gather self-reported information, genomic information, and medical record information on 1 million volunteers, 1 million veterans who volunteer to participate in this study, so that we can understand the mechanisms of disease and many diseases. With a sample size that large, we really have a lot of opportunity to look for all sorts of different health issues and the genetic underpinnings of those health issues. So it was recognized fairly early that, hey, this would be a great chance to look at Gulf War illness, because as many of you probably know, not everybody who was in the theater of war and possibly or even probably exposed to the same things got the same symptoms. And so this person here was exposed to something. I was in the middle, this person there was, and maybe one of the three of us actually got what we call Gulf War illness now. So we think there's a genetic component to this. We think that there's a genetic predisposition and that there's possibly an interaction between a person's genes and their exposures that might be causing the illness in Gulf War veterans. And so having a large sample and then focusing on this particular problem is a rare opportunity because it just takes a very large number of people to do this sort of work. And so CSP 2006, the Genomics of Gulf War Illness, was established to really understand those genetic contributions, that genetic predisposition to Gulf War illness among the MVP participants who were deployed to the Gulf in 1990 and 91. This is specific for that era, for that cohort. And so what we did is we characterized the cohort of MVP participants, and we established their deployment status, whether they were active duty at the time but not deployed or deployed elsewhere, and whether they were deployed to the Persian Gulf region. And then what we do is what's called a genome-wide association study, which basically is almost like a survey of the genes in our genome. So millions and millions of what we call SNPs, these little units of genetic code, and we do a survey of almost 1 million of those and look for patterns. And then based on those patterns, we associate that with the presence of Gulf War illness, for example. And then from there, we can start to look at which genes might be playing a role in Gulf War illness. Like I mentioned, another important piece of this is we actually want to look at how the environment interacts with those genes and might cause illness. And so we call that a gene by environment interaction analysis. And so the survey that we did, we sent a survey to 110,000 MVP participants who were on active duty status during the 1990-91 thing. And when we looked at that, we wanted to gather information from them about their military experience, their branch, their component, where they were, and also their individual self-reported exposure information. So then pulling all of that together, we can start to answer some of these questions. We also have the possibility of looking at, like what Dr. Abdullah was just talking about, some of the omics, some of the other components of the blood and of the body's lymph cycle, and looking at the metabolism, those metabolomics. That's another possibility that we can do with this project. And all of this is kind of described in a design paper that was published not too long ago in Brain Sciences. So that's available if you have any questions. So, I think a lot of people have heard about this project, but maybe don't understand where it is and probably don't understand why it's taking so long. The timeline here shares some of that background information. So the initial study was initiated in 2015. And then we did a pilot version of this with about 300 participants and refined the questionnaire and refined the processes. In 2016, we got some approvals that were really important, including the ability to use some of the Department of Defense data about deployment status so that we would have, we would know who to focus on in terms of who was on active duty during that time period. By 2017, the MVP project had already been going for about 3 or 4 years. And so the number of participants in MVP was getting to be large enough where we could start to think about our subgroup of Gulf War veterans and Gulf War era veterans being large enough to meet our needs. And the questionnaire was finalized. And finally, in 2018, we actually sent out the surveys to, like I said, 110,000. I'll show you some more examples of that. There were actually the mailings of the initial surveys was in 2 different batches. First one in late 2018, second one in early 2019. And then once the results started to come back in, the information had to be entered into databases and cleaned and processed. And we started to formulate our analytic teams to really try to plan how we were going to take all of this information that was so valuable and that our veterans spent so much time answering those questionnaires and doing a really good job actually of completing those questionnaires. So there was a lot of planning about what we could do. And we got kind of our first hint of some data in mid-2019. And so we had a couple of abstracts that we were able to present to colleagues internally at what we call the MVP science meeting. In 2020, we had a little bit more data. And so we were able to do a little bit more with some of our internal presentations and works in progress sort of things. And finally, in 2021, we really got full access to the analytic data set. Key variables have been created, and the team is just working really hard to analyze these data and to get some of the results out. And so while I'm not going to talk specifically about findings from CSP 2006, I do want to reassure you that very, very soon we're going to be able to publicly present actual findings from this study. To the next slide. Oh, that's just a list of abbreviations. Just to give you a clearer picture of what we started with. So the MVP cohort at the time of the survey administration was around 650,000 people, of whom there were about 110,000 who looked like they were Gulf War era veterans on active duty in 1990-91. So we mailed this questionnaire to 110,000 people, MVP participants. We got 45,000 surveys back. 4,000 of those, or almost 10%, actually were missing some of the most critical information, which was the symptom responses. So we couldn't create a Gulf War illness status from those questionnaires, and so we have excluded those from further analysis. That left us with about 41,077 individuals, of whom 300 were missing deployment status, and we couldn't confirm their deployment status using the DoD records. So we're left with just under 41,000 individuals, of whom 14,000 were deployed and 26,000, almost 700, were not deployed. So this cohort is the largest cohort of Gulf War era veterans characterized by deployment status and by health characteristics that allow us to create a Gulf War illness status for them. So this is really important because it's not just going to create opportunities to do these genetic and gene by environment analyses, but there are many other questions that really can be answered now with this cohort that could really not be answered with any other assembled cohort of Gulf War veterans. So progress to date, like I said, we've got a design manuscript that kind of describes our primary analyses. We've had preliminary analyses presented at our internal meetings in the last 3 years. We have had a couple of presentations at public meetings related to some of the more technical aspects of diversity, racial and ethnic genetic diversity in the MVP cohort more broadly. We've got new people coming into the pipeline. We have a lot of postdoctoral trainees, fellows, doctoral candidate who are contributing, wonderful things to this team and actually represent the future of research and have, now had some exposure and have developed some expertise in Gulf War illness. And I think that's really exciting and promising. And at this moment, we have 5 approved manuscript writing groups. One is looking at the phenotype. So how do we define Gulf War illness, and what does that Gulf War illness look like in this sample? So we're comparing those who are deployed and those who are not deployed and looking at Gulf War illness. An exposure writing group looking at the self-reported exposures that we gathered from the survey. We're also doing working on a paper about recontacting. So, this fact that we mailed out a follow-up survey to 110,000 people, that was the first time MVP had ever done that. It's probably one of the larger surveys that the VA has done for research purposes. And so we're going to talk about that in a manuscript. And then we have these 2 papers looking at that genome-wide association study, just to understand the basic possible link between genetics and Gulf War illness. And then that follow-up gene by environment manuscript or analysis to look at that interaction between your genetics and your exposures. And then we have this other project to take what we know about the 41,000 people and see if we can extrapolate a Gulf War illness status using a combination of the survey and the medical record data for the other 60,000 people who were Gulf War era veterans, because that will give us a larger sample that we can actually will have more power to detect some of these differences and some of these associations. So the next steps, we're really working hard to analyze and publish and disseminate our findings. I really appreciate the opportunity to share our progress with you today. I think really importantly, we've heard from the community, from the Gulf War veteran community and from the clinicians who care for Gulf War veterans, that there are some really important questions about Gulf War illness and COVID. And so we have a proposal right now to amend our protocol to extend or expand our analysis and to get some additional funding to answer some questions about Gulf War illness and COVID. Like I said, this is not about the genetics at this moment. There are some really interesting genetic questions too, but at least the preliminary questions are here on the screen, and they're focused on, what does COVID mean for Gulf War veterans? Am I going to get sick, or am I going to have a problem with the vaccine? Does the vaccine work as well for me? And so those are some of the questions we can ask with this large cohort that can't really be answered with other cohorts. And then I think there are some other analyses that we really want to do as part of building out the research opportunities and expanding the questions related to CSP 2006, including looking at neurologic conditions, patterns of healthcare use, the concerns about suicidal ideation and suicide risk in Gulf War veterans. And of course, we also want to apply and explore the impact of different case definitions of Gulf War illness on some of these analyses, as well as related conditions or conditions that might be related or appear similar to Gulf War illness, like other chronic multi-symptom illnesses, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, and irritable bowel syndrome. So here is the very large team. MVP is known for a team science approach, and CSP 2006 is no exception to that. It's a very diverse group of people at all levels of training and experience, and across, gosh, at least 6 different VA medical centers and medical schools. And so it's been a joy to work with all these people, and we're all very committed to moving this forward and getting some answers to you as soon as possible. So I think that's it for me.